There is something about sharing your thoughts and feelings late at night that often leads to you being a little less inhibited, a little less guarded. If you think about those times when you sit up really late with someone who you're just getting to know, and even though you aren't necessarily drinking or indulging in other substances, it gets to a certain time and you begin to disclose and divulge aspects of your life that might have seemed inappropriate just a few hours prior. I'd intended to record this a little earlier in the day, but I'm actually quite glad that I left it until later. I've just come out of the gym, humble brag gym. Picture it didn't happen. After a late night session, and I was standing overlooking East Kilbride, the area where I stay, and I had a sense of gratitude and a sense of presence and a sense that life is good. Of course, the reason that that moment was so pleasant was because these moments in my life are fleeting. It made me think how life is a succession of moments that I am often quite unaware of, never mind grateful for. Years ago, before my children were born, I remember sitting in a flat thinking to myself, I need to make this happen. I was toying with the idea of writing a book. I didn't know what way my career was going to go. I was still quite early in my recovery journey. And I remember projecting forward into this hypothetical future where I would reach an imaginary plateau and experience that sense of presence, experience that sense of contentment, that feeling of being free from worry, of feeling comfortable, at ease with yourself and the conditions of your life. And what's odd is that back then I had no idea how life would change in the subsequent years. And ultimately, every dream I've ever had would come true. Every job I ever wanted, I was offered. Right down to the fact that my little girl has red hair. It was quite strange how the life that I had imagined might be possible, but approached with a certain level of justifiable trepidation and realism, manifested so quickly and so specifically. And still, despite those moments where I hypothesised how I would feel if such an event did transpire, that sense of ease never came. What I realised what was happening was I was projecting forward endlessly. Have you ever looked at a landscape, a mountain, and thought it would be amazing to climb that mountain? And then you go one day and you climb the mountain, and when you're climbing the mountain, you're looking at the top. So rather than relishing the climb, which was the object of your curiosity before, you become focused on the peak of the mountain, imagining what the view will be like. You reach the peak, you take a look around, it's novel at first, that wears off. You begin to think, it would be really nice if I had a beer right now. while I'm taking in this wonderful view. And then you think, it'll be a nice walk down. And then as you're walking down, you think, when I get home, I'm going to have a nice bath and chill. And then you get home and you get in the bath. And then when you're in the bath, you just get bored and you think, I'll go and watch a film. That'll be nice. And then you're watching the film and you're like, but it's not the same without some food. And on and on and on it goes. And I just sometimes forget to catch myself frittering away every single moment that only just an hour before I thought was going to be the perfect moment that would produce that feeling we're all chasing. And it was nice to get a little glimpse, a little insight into the fact that even though my life has already turned out beyond my wildest dreams, I still have a dangerous capacity to fail to be grateful for it. My name is Darren McGarvey, and this is Darren Speaks. Hello, folks. Thank you for joining me today. This is the first episode of a new podcast series. After surveying the devastation of the internet for many years, I have decided that we need another unnecessary voice to add to the clamour, and not just an unnecessary voice, but another unnecessary white, male, heterosexual voice with strong opinions and a massive cyclopean ego. I took a look at the internet and thought, you know what this internet really needs? More of me. So this first episode, in collaboration with Paul Shields, shout out to him and the Rebel City podcast, is really just to draw in those of you who are following me on social media and thus are aware that this is occurring. I thought that it might be useful to make the first episode about audience participation, and so I have requested on Facebook for questions, and we'll do a short Ask Me Anything. Really, the idea for the first one is just to let people get a sense of me, for those of you who don't know me, and to decide if this podcast or other content or work that I'm involved in might be something that you would like to invest your time in, because your time is very valuable and there is no shortage of options in terms of how you spend that time. Quick bit about me. I am a hip hop artist who performs under the name Loki. I'm also an author. I have been dabbling in broadcasting the last couple of years. My background is traditionally working class, and I kind of made a name for myself talking, writing, performing around topics loosely themed around things like class, social inequality, trauma, addiction. And so most of you who have arrived here will already be familiar with that. But for those of you who are new, that's a little bit about me. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read some of these questions that have been put in and try and establish some sort of rapport with you, the listener. I quite enjoy talking. Words to me are like music. And when they are arranged in a certain way and spoken with a certain conviction, a harmony is produced that I find immediately arresting. And so, any chance I get to chat, to think out loud, I'll take it. And what's great about this episode is it's just me. I don't have to contend with somebody else's opinion on something. And sometimes that's quite nice. So the first question I've got is from Paul Smith. Shout out to Paul Smith, aka Crash Slaughter. How easy is it to actually lay AstroTurf? Asking for a friend. This is a question in reference to a post I put on Facebook where basically was talking about my wife and I, we got pretty serious into decorating during lockdown. I decided that maybe it might be useful to put some AstroTurf down on the slabs at the back, and my wife, being a doer to the extreme, acquired AstroTurf within hours. And actually, Paul, as you know, being a married man, it was actually Becky who laid the AstroTurf, and it was just me who put the idea out there. So I would consult her, because she is definitely the brains of a significant portion of this outfit. Right, next question. Cross Ferrato. What do you think about Sturgeon's anti-salmon conspiracy chat and SNP division generally? I don't think about it that much. I think that the divisions are differentiated roughly along lines of the culture war, and Sturgeon and Salmond are just kind of figureheads representing the same kind of dichotomy that we see in every other area of life, whether people are arguing about who should play Batman or whether they're arguing about sports. There's usually a breakdown between roughly two groups who have slightly different hierarchies of concerns, and they come into conflict. Obviously, that's not to say that the independence movement doesn't have some attributes that are unique to it. Obviously, the constitutional question in Scotland is very prominent and very important, and that should be debated and that should be discussed. However, I do feel that people's reasoning through the available evidence in relation to Salmon's court case and other peripheral issues is motivated mainly by a prior position that they have on an issue or on a public figure. So if you're deeply emotionally invested in the idea of Sturgeon as well as independence, then you will tend to interpret the available evidence in such a way that is extremely accommodating to your pre-existing views that you have publicly aired on multiple social media sites and anybody else who would listen. Similarly for Salmond. And I generally, for me personally, I think it's unavoidable that Salmon's behaviour was going to create some sort of sideshow. Obviously, the court has found that his behaviour, which, despite being odious, doesn't necessarily meet the threshold of criminality. People on the other side of the discussion will say that that's because there's a systemic issue with the justice system in terms of how sexual assault cases are executed, and that this is why we see such low prosecution rates for crimes of this nature. But away from the specificities in relation to this, I try to not get too involved because people feel very passionate, and the internet is not the best medium to discuss complicated issues in a passionate way, as much as that is the opposite of our impulse often. And I feel that some of the issues in the mix in relation to this are a bit too serious and a bit beyond my personal experience or expertise to just be diving in. But that's just me personally. Eddie Cointreau, have you got a Doug for anyone out there who is not living in the central belt of Scotland? Doug is dog. No, I don't have a dog. I have no plans of getting a dog. Although what I plan for in this household is not necessarily any consequence to anyone. If other people in this house, including a 2-year-old little girl, decide that we're getting a dog, I'll probably come home one day and find a dog in the house, and I'll just have to deal with that. Kevin Irvin, have you felt any type of pressure when writing the next book? Will you measure the success by comparing it to an award-winning debut? Thanks for the question, Kevin. Kevin's referencing my first book, Poverty Safari, was a mix of memoir, journalism, political, social commentary, that the success of which surprised me greatly and continues to surprise me. It's just about to be published in the United States this week. And it's been published in 12, 13 other languages. It won the Orwell Prize for Books in 2018. And ultimately, the reception of the book has changed the whole direction of my life and career. So, yes, there is pressure with the second book. But more to the point, aside from the superficial pressure of, the kind of the second album syndrome, the process of writing a book is immensely challenging. You're dealing with an often unwieldy quantity of words. And for someone like me who's a bit ADHD, I'm very good at coming up with the ideas, but organising them coherently in terms of a chapter structure and a clear outline, and being able to go into an office in London and explain to someone who's just invested a lot of money in me precisely what it is I intend to do with the book, I find that very difficult. Because ultimately my process with the book is very similar to my process with music. I follow my impulses. I follow what's interesting. I put myself in situations and scenarios out of my comfort zone, and then I'll feed back on that in my writing. And so often the book is being written out of sequence. The book is being written without a clear theme. I spend a great deal of time just casting the net quite wide, and then the themes become apparent to me later. Now, this is an enjoyable process, but also it's difficult for me to convey to other people who are interested to know what the book is about or when it would be finished, like publishers, for example. Any of that information, it's difficult for me to say precisely, here is the title, here's what's going on. And that would be the case in any normal set of circumstances anyway. However, the last 3 years, not only has my life been rendered unrecognisable by the dramatic shift in my social and economic and professional circumstances, and also a lot of personal troubles that have come into my life as a result of the pressures that have come with becoming more publicly noted across the UK rather than just in Scotland. So it took me a while just to kind of adjust to that, and I found certain aspects of it challenging. I did keep working on the book though. The other aspect of this is that society is going through its own turmoil. So I began this book before Brexit. I began this book before that matter was settled. Now, I know it's still not been entirely concluded, but I think everybody's accepted that we will be leaving the EU. It's just a case of how aggressively will we extricate ourselves from it, and what are the implications for Britain economically, for Scotland politically, so on and so forth. So when you begin a book before a kind of momentous cultural or political event such as that, when that event transpires, it recontextualises everything that you've written about. You can't publish a book that doesn't make reference to it. So you have to go back through what you've written and rejig things. And then, of course, coronavirus, COVID-19, which in many ways sort of concentrated everyone's minds, but I was halfway through the book when this happened. And so then suddenly this places everything in a new context. And really, I realised that the problem that I had, apart from the self-doubt and the anxiety about, knowing that hundreds of thousands of people are going to actually read this book I didn't have that pressure before. The pressure with Poverty Safari was just, can I finish this? I was just trying to prove to myself that I could do it, because I had a deep belief that people like me don't write books. So with this one, I'm trying to expand the scope and be a bit more ambitious. And also, I'm aware that there's a lot of people out there who see me as part of a misery memoir genre. And while I definitely think personal experience in my case is very valid, when I'm trying to discuss issues like poverty or trauma or so on and so forth, there are more strings in my bow than that. And so that's something that I want to demonstrate with this book, not just for the sake of demonstrating it, but to challenge myself. So the scope of what's being discussed in the book, the reader will hopefully find to be a lot broader than the first one. It's not as localised, it's not as regional. There are aspects of my personal life in there, but they're more contemporary rather than always reflecting on my childhood. I deal with topics like suicide, homelessness, the drug deaths, the crisis of social connection, the hostile environment policy. I have a chapter in there about political exclusion, which takes place in Lancaster West Estate, which is where Grenfell Tower is. I have a chapter about the London Underground. I visited a south east seaside town called Margate, and there's a chapter in there about immigration. And so I got around a lot, but then the last few months I've been in lockdown, so I haven't been able to work very much because I've got young children, and it's either work and be agitated all the time by the noise, or just drop the work and just be daddy. So yeah, pressure, long-winded answer, but it's a complicated question. I'll take a couple more questions. Let's have a wee look. Is big disaster capitalism behind the rake of COVID conspiracy theories? Interesting question. So, big disaster capitalism, I mean, what we're talking about really is a society, a civilization where the central principle is supply and demand. So if people who understandably have developed a pathological distrust of authority figures through growing up in communities that weren't looked after and were allowed to fall into disrepair, develop intuitions that governments can't be trusted and that authority figures can't be trusted and that police can't be trusted, but no one in the mainstream discourse acknowledges that and validates that and reinforces that that's actually the correct attitude to take based on your experience, then people feel marginalised and people feel that their voice is not included in the conversation about reality. So when characters like David Icke or Tommy Robinson or Nigel Farage or whoever come into the mainstream and are held up in the mainstream as controversial figures and are given platforms to speak, then people who have felt marginalised and that their views aren't represented, they become deeply endeared to these figures without necessarily understanding the full implications of what that means. People like David Icke or Tommy Robinson or Farage or Steve Bannon, they have a charming way about them. They speak very frankly. And not every single thing that they say is lies either. What happens is that people seize on the kernel of truth within it, and then they become emotionally invested in that person. And so then the half-truths and the lies and the hyperbole become increasingly easier to swallow. And one of the problems I think with capitalism in terms of how things play out on the internet is that everything is now based on an advertising model. So it doesn't matter about the veracity of information. What matters is what validates the information or what authenticates the information is that it's widely distributed, disseminated, that it creates interactions, that ultimately the viewer, their attention span, their cognitive bandwidth is the product that's for sale. So the longer we spend online, listening to me on a podcast, listening to whomever, then somebody's making money off of that. even if the effects of what's being discussed socially are corrosive and destabilising, even if it means that people internalise beliefs that actually push them further from the truth that they think that they're trying to reach. Now, sometimes I can be dismissive of some of the conspiracy theories, or meaning it in jest, and then I realise it's been interpreted quite seriously online, and I've definitely felt a sense of surprise and shock and tension, even with people that I'm close to, people that I know, and I know you guys are all the same. There's been a kind of mass unsheathing of people that we thought were cool or sound, and then subsequently, because of whatever their opinion happens to be on a certain issue, we find them to be, unlikable or not worthy of our respect any longer. And this is just a kind of byproduct, I think, of the social media age. And it's also part of a broader trend, which is we've handed control of the facilitation of organised human life to multinational corporations whose loyalty is to their shareholders. So we haven't performed risk assessments on what happens when you give billions of people access to military-grade communication and information technology. No one sat down and thought, what might be the effect on democracy? What might be the effect on mental health? All that registered was, this could be highly profitable. This will be great for the stock market. This will be another capitalist success story, and maybe something will trickle down as well. Increasingly, it's not money that's trickling down. It's the bargain basement technology that we get access to. So I think that the COVID conspiracies, they range from the kind of innocuous to the, in my view, quite dangerous. I've got friends that are recovering from cancer. They're very physically and mentally vulnerable, and they quite rightly have, scepticism of public services, because in lockdown there isn't a lot of support for people out there. I've got people who are struggling with mental health problems. I've got kids. One of them has asthma. The other one might have asthma. So obviously it really kind of rouses my defence mechanisms when I see people, encouraging people not to wear masks, or encouraging people to not disobey the government like we are subservient, but to be so uncooperative. I think that the lockdown measures are sometimes kind of clumsy, blunt instruments. Absolutely. Do I think that the governments across Europe have mishandled this in many instances? Absolutely. Do I think people have a right to be sceptical of government and distrust the government, and to some extent sections of the media? Absolutely. But also, this is a virus a lot of people still don't know much about. And if we're going to criticise anything, I would be looking at the economic system that has been defunding public services for 10 years under the guise of efficiency. Only really, when you look at it, to defer the cost of having to reinvest in them in the aftermath of this crisis. So really what we should be focusing on is the economic status quo. The status quo that says, if you say, let's fund hospitals, schools, libraries, let's create a windfall tax, let's get Amazon, Microsoft, all these companies that have made hundreds of billions during the pandemic to invest in the nation states and the communities through the tax systems, so that we can make the fundamentals of our society a lot stronger. The first question you're going to get is, but who will pay for it? Because you've got people out there who genuinely believe that you shouldn't be heavily taxing the wealthy. They think that that is oppressive. They think that that will drive competition away. And, I'm all for respecting other viewpoints, but I think that if COVID-19 is the reason that you've decided to take to the streets, then I think you've not been paying attention up until this point, personally. And I don't mean that disparagingly, but there have been countless reasons to engage in direct action, to disobey laws, to protest and engage in other forms of civil disobedience, to mobilise. And I just think that this choosing this moment in history to become politically active is possibly, not in my view, the most productive use of your time and energy. But that's just me. What was the biggest eye-opener, either shocking or uplifting, from the TV series? Good question, Glenn. Glenn Jones. He was one of the participants in the series. Actually, Glenn's story was a big eye-opener, and I'll be writing about that in my book. The episode in The Borders, which was about mental health and isolation. It was a real eye-opener for me because, like many city-dwelling knobheads, then I had a kind of view about rural life, being predominantly affluent Tories, living in big houses, remote, isolated from the conditions of urban life and the reality of poverty. And actually the reverse was true. Me, somebody who considers himself pretty left-wing, I don't know necessarily if I would qualify as a socialist now. It's certainly not in the eyes of a lot of people on the left. But then again, who does qualify in their eyes for anything other than cancellation? But I definitely found that the problems of poverty are just as bad in rural areas, and actually exacerbated because of rural areas. So people have to travel further. So say someone's job searching, there might only be one bus that's travelling from one town to some other area. Also just the isolation aspect of if you live on your own. And then there's this other aspect as well, just human nature. Word travels really fast in a little town. So if you are having a bad time, you misbehave, or you've got an addiction, or you have some kind of breakdown, that can stay with you. You can become stigmatised in the community's eyes, and that's really difficult for some people. In a place like Glasgow, you're afforded a certain level of anonymity because you're just another doubt in a massive ashtray that nobody's paying a great deal of attention to. But for people in rural communities, it can be quite different. So I would say that was probably, one of many preconceptions that I found really challenged my viewpoints. I start work on series 2 actually tomorrow. When you fall off the wagon, how do you deal with your opinion of yourself? Does it change? It's an interesting question. If I have an opinion of myself, that's a problem. So that for me has to function as a kind of early warning sign. If I'm walking around with an opinion of myself, there's a certain level of egoism involved in that. There's a certain level of self-concern involved in that that's not necessarily healthy for me, someone who is managing on a daily basis an alcohol and drug addiction. So for me, having an opinion of myself, that means I have to be spending a lot of time ruminating about me. The more I ruminate about me, the more I think about me, the more pain I'm in, the more distress I feel. And, it just takes maybe a few days or a few weeks of me becoming consumed by self. And it might just begin by having an opinion of myself that I can become deeply unwell, And that certainly happened to me on a number of occasions in the last couple of years. I mean, imagine how much of an ego trip it is where everywhere you go for a year, there are hundreds of people there to see you. Everything you do sells out. Everything you say is well received. You're enjoying a very pleasant, cultural buoyancy, where after years of struggle, it's like every door's just been held open for you this way, Mr. McGarvey. But actually, in truth, that's very dangerous for me if I'm not grounded and anchored to the reality, which is that nothing of any value in my life has came to me necessarily just because of my own effort. It's because of the support that I've had from friends and family and recovery community. So when I think I'm running the show and I'm walking around thinking of my opinion of myself, that's a red flag. Hope that answers your question. Within the music industry in Scotland, many unsigned artists are told to go down the do-it-yourself route. This often has an effect on poorer musicians who might not be able to afford technology, studio time or budget to film a decent quality video. Do you think the DIY attitude has had a positive, negative effect on social class of musicians? Good question, David. Jack. The music industry is dominated. The formal music industry, obviously there's a massive music industry of working class people who are doing gigs and promoting gigs and working in the bars and doing the doors, and all of this comes within the wheelhouse of a music industry. But I think if you look at the artists that, if you look at the sort of taste of the say awards, if you look at not necessarily everyone who wins it, but if you just look at the general spread of artists that make it into the shortlist, then you're likely to find that people from middle class backgrounds or who have ascended into middle class backgrounds are disproportionately represented, and this is the case in the arts generally, and this is the case across society and politics and the third sector, because people who have less baggage to carry can travel further faster. It's just basic social physics. So if you're struggling and you have no access to equipment and you're dealing with low self-esteem and mental health problems as a result of a traumatic or adverse childhood experience, then you are facing a number of barriers. My own experience was, after I left home at 16, I never had access to the internet properly until my mid to late 20s. And still, that wasn't even in my own accommodation. That was a partner at the time. But I was industrious and I was focused, and I did take a very DIY attitude to what I was doing, and that served me well. I think it can be easy for people to go up and give lectures, and my wife and I were discussing this. She's an associate lecturer at University of West of Scotland, and so she's got insight as a performer and a songwriter, about to do a PhD. She's got a master's in songwriting. She's a very, very clever woman, a very, very talented woman. And, sometimes we discuss this kind of clash between a certain era of musicians who are still well known and respected, but often offering younger musicians advice that doesn't necessarily apply now in the digital age and the proliferation of technology and all the things and tools that are at our disposal. I think that young people generally have more opportunities now to get their stuff out there, but maybe don't have as many opportunities in terms of getting access to education so that they can learn how to do that properly. But no matter what point in history you happen to be coming up in a music scene, there's always going to be pros and cons. And, the people who succeed are the people who are devoted to the craft of whatever it is that they do until the talent and ability becomes undeniable. A couple more questions and then I'm going to stop for the night. Sarah and Duck or Pingo? Pingo all day. Would you like to be a guest on my podcast? Don't hold your waist. Andy Smith. Absolutely. I think this is the Andy Smith who I used to go to school with as well, so that'll be an interesting reunion. Okay. Final question. How do they trains into the the trains into the underground? Do they build them down there? Or is it like a ship in the bottle thing where it's pulled together with a big string? Brilliant question. A question I don't necessarily know the answer to. Final question, right? I know I said the last one was the final one, but that was a kind of piss take question. Hang on, I think someone sent me one in a private message, and it was quite a poignant one, so I'll go and find it. Okay. Where is it? Right. How do you overcome addiction? Asking for myself. Okay. Well, personally, for me, I have not overcome addiction. I manage my addiction and alcoholism on a daily basis, and I do that by following some simple steps. Steps that at first might seem like a lot, but when you realise what's at stake, your life, then you become more willing to put in whatever work or action is required. And once you start to see that that action is having a positive effect, you develop faith in that action. And then eventually it becomes more intuitive rather than a new thing that's quite scary and unusual. I've been in recovery for, I've been on a recovery journey for about 12 years. And over half of that I've been in relapse, and just under half of that I've been in recovery and sober. So even though it's been quite a rocky road for me, every single day that I haven't used alcohol or drugs is a win and a miracle. And for me, really, it comes down to understanding that a feature of alcoholism as an addiction is that we can't think honestly about it. So no amount of thinking about how you're going to stop or what aspect of your behaviour you might change. You might only drink on a Friday, or change who you drink with, or da 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 da. If you actually look honestly at the evidence, if you're a problem drinker, you're going to find years and years of evidence that you cannot drink safely, that you will never be able to drink safely. So why is it that you would persist to attempt to drink safely, or to believe that this time you might control and enjoy it, or hit the fuck it button? What is it that drives you back again and again? And I just believe, in my experience tells me this, that it's just like a mental illness. It's a mental illness that the head is telling you all the time that you can do something that your body is just physically not capable of processing. And that the way around that is to accept that you will never be able to drink safely, and to just stop fighting. Stop fighting it. Just give up. Admit you have no power over alcohol. You can't even think about alcohol honestly. And this applies to addictive behaviour generally, whatever it might be: sex addiction, food addiction. Every addiction has different properties. Every addiction needs to be treated differently. But the common theme with all addictions is that people persist in the behaviour in spite of the damage it's doing in their life and their health, to their relationships and their prospects in life. And so one of the ways of dealing with that is to accept it's a problem, and then get yourself around people who have solved the problem. Spend time with people who have managed to figure a way of living that does not just not involve taking the drug, but involves really embracing life and enjoying it, and not missing the days where you drank or got high or whatever else you did to avoid ultimately how you feel. I'm in a place today, and I mean literally today, this 24-hour window of acceptance about my addiction, my alcoholism. Every day I try and put in a little bit of work, investing in my recovery, so I've got a wee bit of recovery in the bank for the days where I'm being pulled in different directions. But within a week, it could very much be I'm off my nut, not necessarily drinking or using. If I get caught up thinking about myself, what do I want, what do I need, what did they say, I'm going to get him, or I don't like that, da 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 da, all that stuff. So recovery gives me options. Recovery gives me the option to respond to life rather than react. Recovery gives me the option to bite my tongue rather than say something in anger and create a potential conflict. And ultimately, recovery gives me the option of not just being sober, but of getting a deep sense of usefulness out of spending time with other people who are struggling and recognising not only how that helps them, but how that helps me to stay sober. Hope that answered your question. I've enjoyed this first episode. I hope you have too. These will be dropping weekly. If they aren't for any reason, because things do come up, then I'll do my best to let you know. Check me out on Facebook, Darren Loki McGarvey. Check me out on Twitter, at Loki Scottish Rap. Loki Scottish Rap for Instagram also. And Loki The Scottish Rapper on YouTube. And spread the word. If you've enjoyed this, if you have any feedback or any criticisms or whatever, you'll find me in those places that I've mentioned, and you can certainly do your best to convey whatever you think or feel to me, and if I see it, I'll do my best to respond. I wish you all well. I hope this has been okay, and I'll catch you again soon. Peace.